Imagine judging every city in the world by whether it looks like Paris. You wouldn't just misdescribe Lagos or Buenos Aires. Instead, you'd misunderstand a lot of things about them in the first place. That's roughly what happens to regional organizations such as MERCOSUR, the African Union, or ASEAN, because so often we treat the European Union as a template or standard of regional integration. Why does this happen, and what would it take to study regionalism in a way that doesn't treat Europe as the default? In this video, I address this question by discussing one of my recent book chapters. It appeared in an edited open access series with the United Nations University Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies. If you'd like to read it or find out more, the chapter and the full edited volume are linked in the description below. When people hear regional integration, they often first think of the European Union. It's easy to imagine a commission, a parliament, an integrated market, the euro, and this basically gives you the sense that the quote-unquote successful endpoint of integration is something like Brussels. But in reality, the world is full of regional organizations which take many different forms. 70 years ago, in 1955, each country in the world belonged to 1.1 regional organizations on average. Today, that number is over 5. That's a structural transformation in how states coordinate in virtually all aspects, from trade and development to security, environmental policy, and beyond. Now here's the problem. If we treat the EU as the benchmark for successful integration, it's very easy to conclude that many non-European organizations are, to a greater or lesser extent, outright failures. And unsurprisingly, that's exactly what many scholars and commentators actually do conclude. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, but generally with the same underlying idea. Now, to be fair, not everyone thinks, or at least says or writes, that most regional organizations are failures. A lot of scholars have come up with labels for regionalism. Some of them are informal, post-hegemonic, intergovernmental, soft, liquid, and so on. Others even drop the word regionalism and use terms such as symmetry, talk shops, or thin institutionalization. Now, many of these labels can be analytically useful because they're trying to describe real variation. But there is a pattern hidden inside them. They often function like qualifiers that imply this is regionalism, but not the full version. And once you do that, qualification or evaluation becomes highly predictable. The closer something looks to the EU, the better it scores. In other words, even though most scholars and commentators won't say it, and might not even genuinely think of it that way, what this use of qualifiers implies is that EU-style integration becomes the unspoken original of regionalism, and everything else becomes a deviation. In other words, the EU becomes the noun, and everything else becomes just an adjective. Now, arguments claiming the quote-unquote failure of regional organizations and the use of qualifiers for regionalism are most widespread when we talk about regional organizations in the Global South. The Global South is a term that basically many scholars and international organizations such as the UN use to refer to countries that are mostly part of the developing world or what was previously called the Third World. The Global South, or whatever term you'd like to use to refer to these parts of the world, matters a lot because when you look at the numbers, it makes up most of the world. By my definition, it includes over 3/4 of both global population and state count. But however you tweak the definition, it clearly accounts for way more than half. This means that most regional organizations in the world today are formed by countries in the Global South. In this context, we see commonly repeated arguments that African integration fails to help economic growth or that Latin America has quote-unquote dysfunctional regional institutions, or that ASEAN, the Union of Southeast Asian Nations, might quote-unquote face irrelevance and the like. These criticisms are so widespread that they form an entire strand of literature, which implies what seems to me to be an unusual assumption. It's rarely stated this bluntly, but it seems clear to me that it underpins the argument for failing regionalism in the Global South. And the assumption is basically that hundreds of governments across the Global South, and remember this includes various consecutive governments from different political parties with different leaders and so on, have all invested decades and plenty of resources in regional organizations that, on this view, do very little. I'm not saying that governments in developing countries are perfect or always efficient, and it's well documented that there has been corruption in some cases, but claiming that the majority of them have been wasting time and money for 70 years with very little effect seems like a bit of a stretch. It's also somewhat patronizing, although that's part of another discussion. There's also another problem, which is that many of the authors that make various arguments for the failure of regional organizations in Latin America, Africa, or other regions have either never tried or never succeeded in explaining why these organizations there have developed in a particular trajectory different from their expectations or benchmarks. In other words, they're criticizing something that they don't seem to be able to explain, or at least explain well, in the first place. I think a part of the issue that causes this rift, this misalignment of expectations and inability to explain processes in the Global South, has to do with historical conditions. When I use the term Global South, I refer to parts of the world that are mostly made up of states shaped by colonial legacies, of course, each in its own way. These are also parts of the world that experienced late industrialization, external economic dependence, and various forms of marginalization in global governance. To me, it seems obvious that such countries will not produce copies of the European Union because, first of all, their historical conditions are clearly different, and second, even if they weren't, the resources at their disposal are only a fraction of those in Brussels. Just have a quick look at their budgets, balance them against their achievements, and think again whether they're failing. Let's look at, for instance, ASEAN, which has helped to sustain peace in Southeast Asia, certainly boosted economic integration in the region, and served as a mechanism for managing recurrent crises. The population of the region is nearly 700 million people, which is considerably larger than the EU. And ASEAN's annual budget is under $20 million. This number is over 8,000 times smaller than that of the EU. Again, we're talking about an 8,000 times smaller budget. My argument is not about ASEAN, but about a broader point, which is that there are dozens of various regional organizations across the Global South which have small budgets, and at least some of them have visible achievements, and they function in a historical context markedly different from that of Europe. The question is then, why would anyone judge them against EU-style standards? The general answer is embedded in the term Eurocentrism. In general, the term Eurocentrism means taking European or Western history, customs, and so on as central, superior, or universal, while marginalizing or misrepresenting non-Western cultures. Here we're not talking about culture, we're talking about regionalism, and in the context of this video and my chapter, what I mean by Eurocentrism is taking Europe's regional model of integration and treating it as the default template for other regions. But Eurocentrism doesn't just appear or sustain itself out of the blue. European institutions have actively promoted the EU model as the model to follow through delegation programs, research funding streams, policy networks, and explicit encouragement for other blocs to emulate EU-style integration. For instance, in 2002, the EU announced a program to provide 200 million euros to support MERCOSUR member states, explicitly linked to this idea of emulation. But again, this video and my chapter are not about a particular case, but about the broader trend that emerges. Of course, from the EU's perspective, promoting its model is a form of institutional diplomacy, and it also helps to increase its global influence. There's not necessarily any bad intent in this. But from the standpoint of research and analysis for scholars like myself and my colleagues, this produces an unintended side effect. And the side effect is that expectations get skewed and everyone starts to expect regional organizations elsewhere to develop like the EU. So that explains why qualifiers like failure or anything along these lines become the default label when regions don't reproduce the Brussels model. Now, more importantly, there are also tacit forces that reproduce Eurocentric expectations. And they're embedded in mainstream theories of regionalism. These theories are important because they sit at the core of the canon. They shape what students learn, what many peer reviewers expect, and what policymakers recognize as quote-unquote serious integration. Their impact is amplified across the globe by universities and research publication structures. The most prominent regionalism theories were largely developed by scholars of European origin whose ideas were shaped directly by the interwar period and World War II. They were motivated by one overriding goal: preventing another European catastrophe. That goal was, and of course is, admirable. But the academic problem we have today is that theories to provide a path for European integration just don't translate well to other regions. My argument is that this is because of their assumptions. Let me walk you through it by briefly discussing core theoretical families and why they often misread the Global South. First, we have federalism and the political unification paradigm. Here, seminal authors include Altiero Spinelli and Ernesto Rossi, Kenneth Weir, and Amitai Etzioni. Long story short, federalist thinking assumes integration works because states face two strong pressures: a serious fear of war with neighbors and/or high levels of existing economic interdependence. But in much of the Global South, first, large-scale interstate wars are historically rarer than European state formation narratives would suggest. That's not to say that conflict is rare, but that's to say that the way it takes place does not resemble the interstate wars that shaped Europe's history. And second, economies were and are often structured through colonial or post-colonial trade patterns for external export rather than dense intra-regional production chains. We can see that in the numbers. Intra-regional trade is around 13% in Africa and about 20% in Latin America and ASEAN, compared to over 60% in the EU. So a theory built on deep economic glue and war avoidance pressure struggles when those conditions simply aren't the dominant drivers. Then we have functionalism and neofunctionalism, developed originally by David Mitrani and Ernst Haas. Functionalism imagines integration advancing through technocratic problem solving, meaning experts coordinating technical sectors and reducing political friction. Neofunctionalism adds the famous spillover logic: start technical, then expand, pushed by external threats, societal demand for prosperity, and political responses. In contrast to these assumptions, in many Global South contexts, we see, number one, leadership of regional organizations is often openly political and not technocratic. Number two, the single massive external threat assumption doesn't map neatly across regions. Threats are often multiple, related to criminal gangs, or internal to a country, or extra-regional. And number three, civil society capacity to drive bottom-up integration often differs greatly from the post-war European ideal type. So the problem is, again, that theories based on such assumptions don't travel well in the global south. Third, we have transactionalism, or the so-called we-feeling model, largely pioneered by Karl Deutsch and developed by various scholars afterwards. Transactionalism expects integration to deepen as cross-border communication creates predictability, shared values, and eventually a we-feeling. But many states in the global south are still managing fragmented national identities and intense internal economic disparities. So, in fact, integration is much more often elite-driven, and intergovernmental presidential summits, ministerial meetings, high-level bargaining, and the like dominate. So you don't see that much community-driven identity convergence. Each time, the point is the same. The mainstream theories are not wrong. They're just context-bound. They apply to Europe well, but just don't fit the historical conditions of the global south. Now, some of you at this point will probably object and point out that the families of theories that I'm talking about are old, and I'll discuss that in a moment. But before doing that, let me just remind you again that these theories are still taught at most universities in the world as the core of the canon to any students taking a course on regionalism. So they may be old, but they're still very much present in the university classroom. In any case, to the point of newer theories and approaches, of course they exist and most prominently include two strands. One is new regionalism and the other is comparative regionalism. They can be helpful, but they're not a panacea. The problem here is that even when newer frameworks try to be more global, they don't necessarily address the issues of fundamental differences in historical conditions. For instance, new regionalism incorporates non-state actors such as private companies and civil society in promoting integration. But if you go to a developing region, you'll usually notice very quickly that companies generally seek to avoid political trouble and NGOs are heavily underfunded. And actually many of them rely on external funding from developed countries in the global north. In this context, new regionalism can provide supplementary insights which are certainly useful, but cannot form the basis of a general holistic regionalism theory for the global south. Comparative regionalism is potentially more promising, but it really depends on how it's applied. The question is who compares which regions or organizations and how so? The trap, of course, is smuggling in norms where EU-style expectations for integration remain the baseline. So, what do we do now instead? Well, I propose 5 steps for the study of regionalism, which are basically calling for a reset of how we study regionalism beyond Europe. Step number 1 is treat the EU as sui generis, unique. Europe's integration was shaped by post-war reconstruction, intense shared security concerns, and high interdependence. Don't universalize it. Step number 2, take history seriously. Colonial legacies, struggles for independence, and sovereignty anxieties shape what integration even means in many regions. Step 3, explain before you critique. Don't label failure until you've actually mapped the drivers, constraints, and goals of cooperation in a given region. Step number 4, build independent scholarship in the global south. Make room, institutionally and financially, for regionally grounded theory building that isn't forced into inherited European frames. Step number 5, embrace pluralism. There's no single blueprint. Different regions can build different models for cooperation. And those differences may be rational adaptations and not deficits. So next time you see a headline saying that the African Union or MERCOSUR or ASEAN is failing, irrelevant, or dysfunctional, it's worth taking a moment to pause and ask, by whose standards? And then ask a second question. What problem were these regional organizations actually trying to solve, and did they solve enough of it to justify why states keep showing up, paying in, and staying in? Because if we get the standards wrong, we don't just misunderstand the global south. We misunderstand how global order is being built in real time. So don't grade every city by Paris, and don't grade every region by Brussels.